Most polling averages have Harris ahead of Trump, usually by about 3 to 4%. But if you actually dive into the numbers here, Harris is probably at best tied and probably a little bit behind. Why do I say this? Well, let's take as a starting point just one polling average. This is from Nate Silver, who has Harris at about 3.5% higher than Trump right now. And I like Silver's model because he takes into account the quality and historical record of polls and kind of builds that in to how he weights the polls. So Silver has Harris 3.5% above Trump in the polling averages, yet has Trump's winning the election at 55.8% probability. And that's almost exactly what the prediction markets say this morning as well. So how could it be that she's leading by a few points in the polls, but still has a lower probability of winning? Well, there's a few reasons. Number one is what they call the post-convention bounce. We're still in this immediate period after the convention where typically whoever the candidate is coming out of the convention overperforms and then comes down to earth. And so that's worth a few points, according to most people, including Silver, who builds that into his model. Second, and this is one that's a little bit murkier, is that polls historically have underweighted Trump's support, obviously most notably in 2016, where he overperformed the polls, but he traditionally does better than what the polls think he'll do. And Nate Silver wrote a long piece about this where he actually doesn't think this is going to be as much of a factor in this election. And one reason, and Silver doesn't go into this particular reason in detail, but this is one that I surmise here, is that there's a counter effect going on here, which is the post-Dobbs effect, where Democrats tend to overperform at the ballot box after the Dobbs decision. Most notably, this happened in the midterm election. Now, this hasn't been tested in an election where Trump's on the ballot and in the presidential elections. So it'll be interesting to see how these two effects counter-effect each other. And then, obviously, the pollsters, you'd think, are building in something in their model to try to guard against this. Now, you can't say that for sure, but one can imagine. But by far the most important factor here that's creating this discrepancy between the polls and the prediction models is what they call the Electoral college bias, right? Because you can't just win the popular vote. You have to actually win a majority of the Electoral college vote. And Democrats have a long history now of winning the popular vote and losing the Electoral college, most recently in 2016. And Silver helpfully provides a chart that actually tells you, all right, what percentage of the popular vote equates to what probability of winning the Electoral college? And this, if you're a Democrat, is going to be pretty scary. So if Harris merely had 0 to 1% more votes in the national popular vote than Trump, her chances of winning are only 10%. If it goes up to 1 to 2% more popular vote, her chances of winning the Electoral college go to 31%. So even if she was at roughly 2% more in the vote, still doesn't have a greater chance than not of winning the election. That's kind of scary. Once you get to 2 to 3% more popular vote, her probability goes up to 63%. And then really the comfortable areas start to get 3 to 4%, 85%, right? And then you go above 4%, so greater than 9% chance of winning the election. So if you're the Harris team, you basically want to be at 4% or more to really lock this thing in. So when you're reading the polls and saying, all right, well, what does a near sure Harris victory look like? You really need to see polls that are showing 4+%. But again, you have to factor in the post-convention bounce. So really what you should be looking for right now are polls that show Harris up 6+% if you really want that near certainty that she's in good shape here in this election. And then you also have to build in the uncertainty of a few more weeks of campaigning going on. So that's to just pour a little cold water on my Democratic friends out there. Like there is, as David Plouffe and a lot of people on the Harris campaign say, that they view themselves as underdogs. And I don't think that's just coach speak. I actually think that the numbers bear this out. Speaking of numbers, the highest quality poll to come out over the weekend is the ABC News Washington Post poll, which shows a 50% to 46% lead for Harris. So roughly in line with Nate Silver's polling average, a little bit higher. And this has some interesting crosstabs, some interesting data behind those numbers. Number one, they found no post-convention bounce, which is interesting. They found that Harris has maintained her lead over Trump in likability and favorability. They found a wider gender gap, and they found that Harris is viewed as having as running a much more competent campaign. So 56% of Americans in the poll said that she's doing an excellent or good job running her campaign, compared to 41% who say that of Trump. And this is important because often people look at, especially if you haven't been president before, they look at your campaign as a proxy for how you'll be president. Axelrod famously said that the campaign is the polygraph for the soul. Interestingly, 93% of Democrats and 56% of independents rate Harris's campaign positively, as do 24% of Republicans in the poll. So those are pretty fascinating numbers, but there is some danger in here. The public, by a 6-point margin, thinks that Harris is going to win the presidential debate. And as I've talked about before, and we're going to talk about in a debate explainer later this week, the expectations game is key. And you actually don't want to be the person heading into the debates with the public thinking you're going to win, because that means that you have to do even better than, just marginally better than your opponent in order to, quote unquote, win a debate. You have to win over the expectation. There's some numbers here about Walz and Vance as well. And needless to say, Walz is viewed much more favorably than Vance, or put it another way, Vance's unfavorables in this poll are much higher than Walz's unfavorables. For Trump, there's some data in here to point the way as to what could be a good strategy for him. He has a lead in sort of key issue concerns, including trust to handle the economy and trust in inflation, both by 8% more than Harris. He's up 9% on immigration. And so if you're Trump and thinking about what your strategy is, you might want to talk about the Harris-Biden record. You might want to talk about how people view your presidency, which he seems to have more glowing feelings from the electorate than when he actually was president. And this is why I think a lot of commentators are puzzled by Trump's decision to really focus on character attacks right now on Harris instead of ideology and record. Like, every now and then you get these record attacks on Harris and Walz, but they're not coherent and they're not consistent. I talked about the qualities differences. 46% see Harris favorably as a person versus 33% for Trump. And 53% think that Harris is qualified for office versus 47% for Trump. Harris leads Trump by 32 points on having the physical help for the job. That's a 57-25% split. 18% more on honesty and trustworthiness, 10% more on mental acuity, 8% more on understanding the problems of people like you, and 7% more on representing your personal values. A lot of those numbers are flipped from the Biden-Trump head-to-head. And so that's why, if you're Trump, and why he's a little bit, if not very erratic right now, is he is, I think he's got a little bit of vertigo. This race has really turned upside down. But obviously the lead of this whole thing is that Harris has a 13-point lead among women. That's 54%, 41%, while Trump has a 5-point lead among men. Pre-convention, Harris only had a 6% lead among women. So this has really changed. White women have gone from plus 13 for Trump pre-convention to virtually tied right now. And this would be the first time in a long, long time that Democrats have carried white women, if they did, in fact, carry white women, which explains why, in part, Trump has been all over the place on this abortion issue. So, there was a 24-hour period just a few days ago where Trump floated a proposal to cover the cost of IVF procedures for every American. He then implied he would vote for an initiative in Florida guaranteeing access to abortion, and that he took heat from his Republican base and then flip-flopped and said he would vote against that initiative. So this sort of John Kerry voted for it before he voted against it statement. And really, to dive in here, this is Florida Amendment 4, which, if passed, would enshrine abortion rights in that state's constitution. He had signaled openness in an NBC interview that he would support that initiative, and then said, and in that interview he said, "I'm going to be voting that we need more than 6 weeks." Those remarks led to an uproar from abortion activists. One ex-user said Trump has destroyed both the conservative movement and the pro-life movement. He's done even what Barack Obama couldn't do. Mike Pence said, "I'm pro-life. I don't apologize for it." Eric Erickson, the conservative radio host, slammed Trump, saying instead of having all the focus on Kamala Harris interview tonight, Trump decided to further divide the GOP. It's not a good strategy for winning, and that's why Trump has flipped on that issue. So I'm not sure that this back and forth is really going to help him with women, right? I think he was trying to soften his issues with women, and what I think he's done is probably only fed the narrative of chaos within his campaign. Now let's look ahead. What's going on now? We're now past Labor Day. This is the most important part of the campaign cycle, right? This is, where the butter is breaded, the rubber hits the road, or the bread is buttered, and whatever bad metaphor you want. And so where are we right now? We are heading into the heart of the season. So on September 6th, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals is going to hear arguments in Trump's appeal of the E. Jean Carroll case. Most importantly, on September 10th, so next Tuesday, we'll have the second presidential debate. This will be hosted, or really the first, between Harris and Trump. This is hosted by ABC News. It will be in Philadelphia. Trump has also proposed a September 4th and September 25th debate with NBC. Harris has said he's only committed to the 10th. And then, people, think of Election Day as in November, but Election Day is actually 13 days away. So early voting begins in Pennsylvania on September 16th. On that same day, Judge Merchan in New York is expected to rule on Trump's request to dismiss that New York case for which he was found guilty. If that case is not dismissed, the sentencing will happen 2 days later on September 18th. Trump's team had sent a letter to Merchan asking to delay the sentencing. Merchan has not yet responded to that request. On September 20th, early voting begins in Virginia, Minnesota, and South Dakota. On the 26th of September, New York's appeals court hears oral arguments in New York versus Trump. This is the Tish James case, the civil case. On October 1st, we have the vice presidential debate that's hosted by CBS in New York. Vance challenged Wells to a debate also on September 18th, but that hasn't been set. And then voting really starts across the country in tons of states. October 9th, Arizona. October 12th, Nevada. October 15th, Georgia. October 17th, North Carolina. October 22nd, Wisconsin, Utah, Hawaii. October 26th, Michigan, New Jersey, New York. And then November 5th, Election Day. So this is coming at you fast. You're going to see a lot change in this election over the course of the next few weeks. If you're Harris, you want to continue the momentum. If you're Trump, you want to shake things up.